You had a choice this week between reading two readings talking about sources, and this video will focus on how we determine credibility of those sources. Oftentimes, sifting through the dense text that a piece of writing might include can be difficult. So, developing strategies to be able to read and identify whether or not you can believe a source can help you to read more quickly and more confidently. The article by Karen Rosenberg identifies some great strategies for reading rhetorically, which ties into the concept of assessing the credibility of a source. In a research class, we know that identifying the credibility of a source is crucial. Finding reliable sources gives us the best information, and citing reliable sources helps us build a good relationship with the audience. When thinking about how to determine whether or not a source is accurate, one of the things that students say is most helpful in my 104 classes is this acronym, which was mentioned in the ballpoint reading, the CRAP test. CRAP stands for currency, relevance, authority, accuracy, and purpose. By doing this for a source, you can determine whether or not it's believable, and it can help you to understand texts in more depth. If you took 103 and you did a rhetorical analysis, this is a similar sort of process, but it looks less at the specific rhetorical practices used and more at the rhetorical situation. So, currency is the first part of the CRAP test. Here, you're looking to answer questions like when something was published, when it was last updated, and whether or not something is current enough for your research. Typically, the rule of thumb in academia is that if something was published within the last 5 years, it qualifies as credible and current. However, this can vary depending on your field and depending on the topic. Just think back to the days of COVID. Early on, recommendations were changing rapidly. So, a source from 2 weeks ago might generally count as current, but based on the situation we were living in, that information was likely considered outdated at that point because there was more research done and more information. Other topics may require citations of sources that are older than 5 years. So if you're citing foundational texts in a field, those might certainly be older than that rule of thumb, and that's okay. When we get to relevance, here you're thinking about how closely the research ties to what you're working on. So you're asking whether or not something fits the scope and the topic of your research, but you also want to ask how something fits the scope and the topic. So not just what, but how. For example, if you are researching free speech on university campuses, it could be helpful to look at other public institutions in Indiana because they have the same laws to follow. Looking at universities overseas or in Canada wouldn't be as relevant because they aren't subject to the same laws that academic institutions in the United States are. When we get to authority here, we're thinking about what authority someone has to be writing about the topic at hand. You'll want to answer questions like who the author is, who the publisher is, and whether or not they're credible. In my in-person 104 class, we typically do an activity where people determine whether or not a source is real and credible or not. Every semester, I include articles from websites like The Onion or The Shovel, and every semester people fall for it and believe that they're credible because they don't research the authority of the source. Just because a website looks good and they cite a study or links to another source, that's not enough alone to say that it's credible. You need to look around more deeply than that because, I hate to break it to you, people on the internet will sometimes not tell the truth. So, checking for authority is important. Accuracy just means checking to make sure that the information is true. So you'll want to make sure that the information is corroborated somewhere else. Sometimes this can look like sources being linked or cited at the end, but we want to make sure that the information is found in multiple places. You'll also want to think about whether or not something is based in fact or opinion. There are lots of ways to check for this, including just a quick search to see what else you can find out. When you do the searching, though, be careful not to just rely on the AI generated answers. These pull from different places on the internet without checking for accuracy. So your best bet is to actually read through a couple of articles, just skim quickly, and determine that way how true something is. Finally, in the CRAB test, we want to think about purpose. When identifying purpose, you want to ask questions about why the information is being published and whether or not there's any bias. So, some people find it easier to talk about this part as following the money. So, if you're watching a TikTok and the person in it keeps talking about how much they love Bloom energy drinks, or how much they love some supplement or outfit or makeup product or whatever, fill in the blank, their purpose isn't inherently to share something just because they like it, right? They're sharing products to get paid. Typically, this needs to be disclosed somewhere in the video or in the hashtags, but more and more often now, these sponsorships and partnerships are more subtle. They just include their favorite energy drink off to the side in the video, or they link to the product in the TikTok shop or an Amazon storefront. And in writing, we can see a lot of purpose being based on an audience. If a news station wants to stir up clicks on their website, to get more eyes on their website, to sell more ads on their website, they might publish a headline that includes buzzwords that they know people will care about. These sorts of articles might also look to make issues seem two-sided, like it's your side versus another side, when in reality, there tends to be a lot more nuance than that, because humans are complex beings. While we're on the topic of assessing source credibility, especially online, it's important to keep in mind that some of the ways you learned to assess sources previously may no longer be the best way to tell whether or not you can trust a source. A lot of times I'll hear from students that they determine whether or not a source is credible based solely on the URL, right? Like a .org tends to be trusted. While this can be a handy and easy trick to remember, unfortunately, it's not actually reliable because people can purchase URLs like a .org and then they put whatever they want on there because, again, while it may seem hard to believe, people on the internet lie. One resource that I really appreciate to check the bias of various sources, particularly when it comes to news, is the Media Bias Chart. This is a tool that lets you check to see where various news sites fall on the spectrum of political bias as well as how opinion-based they might be. I'll link to it in the transcript of this video, so if you're interested in looking at a particular source, you can search for it and read about it. Making sure that we're receiving information from as least biased sources as possible is important because it gives us the clearest, most reliable picture of a situation. For example, this website here is a .org website, and it claims to have research exposing the hazards of dihydrogen monoxide. Take it through the CRAB test. Is it current? So it looks like it was last updated on today's date, January 11th, 2026. So it's certainly current. What about relevance? That certainly depends on your topic. If you're looking at water safety or something like that, it would be relevant. If you're looking at governmental agencies, because it appears to be run by the United States Environmental Assessment Center off to the side here, we would say that's relevant. Okay, so it's current and it's relevant. What about accuracy? We can see here that they're linking to a number of different sources, which might boost their credibility. And they have lots of links directing you to different related agencies and organizations, so that can make it feel more credible. And if you don't know what dihydrogen monoxide is, it sounds scientific, and so some people might be willing to just believe this because it feels smart and uses scientific terms. What authority does the website have? So people will see the United States Environmental Assessment Center logo off to the side and could assume it's a legitimate government organization. If we're using website URL alone as a measure of credibility, it's a .org website. So if we lean on that idea of a URL alone can tell us whether or not something is credible, that means this website is credible. Looking again here at this logo, they've mimicked the logo for the Environmental Protection Agency. So it could look legitimate to people just because it feels like something they've seen somewhere before. And finally, let's think about purpose. What purpose does this website serve? They claim to be serving the public by identifying the dangers of this chemical compound, dihydrogen monoxide. And right now, you hear a lot of discussion about the health of food and drinks in the United States. It's a very hot topic. And so this fits with that discussion, the idea that people are looking at our food and drinks to make sure it's the healthiest it can be or the least harmful it can be from their perspective. So it just passed through all of the CRAP test, right? It's current, it's relevant, it's accurate, it seems. They have the authority to be writing about it, and their purpose seems clear. However, if you look at the small font on the very bottom of the website, you'll see this note, content veracity not implied. Veracity means accuracy. So what this is saying is that the accuracy of the content is not implied, meaning that none of the information is true. So with that note in mind, and by doing some deeper reading, by doing some deeper looking, we can tell that this website is satirical. It's looking at the dangers of drinking water, dihydrogen monoxide, H2O. We know that drinking water is necessary for survival. It's not necessarily a dangerous chemical compound. As far as making connections go with the NACE competencies, the biggest target here is critical thinking. Doesn't seem like that one needs a ton of explanation, but when you can read more effectively, you can understand concepts and situations more effectively, and that makes you a better thinker. Technology is another NACE competency here. It's one that's maybe slightly less obvious, but when we think about how to use media in an analytical way, like websites or social media, when we're consuming information, we can use our technology more appropriately and responsibly. So now that we've practiced applying the CRAP test to this website, you can clearly see how it works and what you can do to determine the credibility of sources. Being aware of how to assess sources lets us be more conscious consumers of information, but also more credible writers. Again, you'll be in situations outside of this class where you read something and need to decide whether or not to believe it. It can be as small as deciding whether or not to purchase something that you saw on TikTok, and it can be as big as influencing you as to who you want to vote for. Another connection that we can highlight here involves developing various strategies for reading materials, which can help us gain a deeper understanding of new texts that we come across. Again, you're going to read texts outside of this class, and they might not always be articles either. You might see a video on Instagram Reels or listen to a podcast on YouTube or Spotify. You need to be able to determine on your own whether or not you can believe something. And the CRAP test and rhetorical reading are both things that can help in these situations. As you research for this project, remember that you don't necessarily need to find sources from the university libraries. You can apply the CRAP test and rhetorical reading to other sources that you find, like websites, newspaper articles, blogs, social media, and more. Those are all things that you can use for this project. But as always, if you have any questions, please make sure to let me know.